second session. Yes, that is a London accent you hear here at the New York Stock Exchange. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Liam Halligan. I'm from Prosperity Capital Management. We've been investing in the Russian market for 16 years. My colleague, our founding partner, Matthias Westman, will be on the next panel, but I'm extremely grateful and honoured to be asked by the New York Stock Exchange to chair this panel on this historic day. You know, there are so many business links between Russia and America. It really is quite humbling when you work with Russia all the time, as we do, going back many years, as we heard earlier. The American companies so heavily invested in Russia, like Pepsi, John Deere, P&G, Ford, GM, the list goes on. We don't always read about them in our newspapers, but as somebody who's spent a lot of the last 16 years in Russia, believe me, America is there, loud and clear, very heavily represented in a business sense. The panel here today, ladies and gentlemen, we've got just over maybe 40 minutes or so. I'm going to introduce them each in turn. Each panelist will just give a 5-minute introduction, and then we'll get into discussion as quickly as possible. We're delighted to have here, as well as Russia's Deputy Prime Minister, of course, who you just heard from, Russia's Deputy Finance Minister as well, Alexei Moiseev. And I'm going to ask him to start.
Thank you very much,
Deputy
Liam.
Minister.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk a little bit about the macro things, and obviously you've heard and you know that the growth in Russia is fairly strong at about 4%, inflation is very low, and in fact we've just seen very encouraging PMI numbers out today, which suggests that the growth momentum is actually improving even further. However, what I'd like to focus on is that this macroeconomic performance Russia has now is probably the most durable it's ever had. And the reason I'm saying this is because I'm very confident in the macroeconomic policy mix we currently have. Now, here's number one is the central bank policy, which has a combination of two things. One is an absence of capital controls, and Russia is the only country among BRICS countries which has no capital controls. And second, it is a flexible exchange rate. A combination of those things actually is a very powerful tool which protects Russian macroeconomic stability against potential volatility in global markets and in global commodity markets in particular. Second thing is the fiscal policy. And here I'm very proud to say that the government has adopted a modernized fiscal rule. And this fiscal rule, the budget rule, is extremely counter-cyclical in nature. And this fiscal rule will allow the government to actually maintain relatively stable fiscal performance, no matter if oil prices fall or if oil prices go. A combination of this fiscal rule and the flexible exchange rate actually is the strongest buffer Russia has ever had against potential volatility in oil markets. I think that, in fact, it is given the combination of those two policy measures, it is very difficult to imagine a circumstance when Russia will witness any situation when the macroeconomic situation really seriously stabilizes. This is a very powerful policy set, and I think it's really going to perform very well.
Pretty big reserves too.
Absolutely. And obviously, if we have more time, I'm happy to talk about this in more detail. However, trying to be within the context of 5 minutes, there's one other topic I think I need to talk about. Russia is a middle-income country. And as you know, for a middle-income country to become a highly developed country, it takes a lot of investments. And to take a lot of investments, we have to improve the investment climate. Russia has massive resource for investment resource, which isn't really fully used, and that's capital flight. This capital flight is a gap between the savings rates we have and the investment rate we have. And we have to do a lot of things to improve that, to turn this around, and to have this coming in. And here, the policy is directed at two major ways. One is a creation of a domestic investor pool. And this is why we have adopted a number of reforms, in particular the so-called roadmap for creation of the International Financial Center, which actually is supposed, among other things, to focus, and will focus, quite a lot on things such as a creation of non-banking domestic financial institutions working as powerful as they can work in countries like the United States. Here I'm talking about the pension funds, I'm talking about the mutual funds, I'm talking about the life insurance companies. These are the institutions which can hopefully very quickly produce a very powerful domestic investment resource, which alongside the international investment resource can hopefully result in a significant improvement in how our Russian capital markets actually are looking. And speaking about international investment resource, we're also doing a lot of things here directed at liberalizing access for foreign investors into the Russian securities markets. And here, of course, I'm talking about euro clearability, I'm talking about the tax initiatives, I'm talking about a lot of other nitty-gritty things which will make Russian markets significantly more hospitable for foreign investors. So here, what I'm really trying to get at is that a combination of very well protected macroeconomic stability, efforts to build powerful domestic investment resource, and efforts to make Russia a more comfortable place for international portfolio investors will result in the so-called Russian discount finally disappearing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being precise. On my left, we have to talk really about the nitty-gritty that the Deputy Finance Minister referred to. We have Vladimir Dmitriev, who's the chairman of Vnesheconombank. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a chairman of Bank for Foreign Economic Affairs and Development of the Russian Federation, which is one of few institutions set up by the government recently to support economic growth and investments into the country. Indeed, recent 5 years were dedicated by the government to create a number of important institutions for development, inclusive Vnesheconombank and subsidiaries of the bank, which work within various sectors of economy. And it is worthwhile to mention that Russian Direct Investment Fund, headed by my colleague Kirill Dmitriev, is one of those institutions which anniversary, anniversary we celebrated last week. Another one is Russian ECA, Export Credit Agency, which was set up last year as well. And it is worthwhile to mention that among those institutions and bodies which were set up recently, recent 5 years, investment fund, improvement of legislation and the law on concessions, special economic zones, and some other entities which are aimed at remove infrastructure impediments of economic growth and to even regional misbalances in our country. What Vnesheconombank and other institutions are doing is to attract long-term investments into the country, to work with infrastructure which improve, which development is aimed at improving economic growth into the country and the growth in key industries of our country. We support, and that was mentioned by the First Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Shuvalov, we support the growth of middle class through special programs dedicated to finance small and medium enterprises in our country, which is implemented by our subsidiary Bank for Small and Medium Enterprises. That's really the infrastructure which support to improve economic development and to attract investments into the country.
Thank you very much, Chairman Dmitriev. It's my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce Olga Diagonova. We all read, didn't we, many years ago about Russia's voucher privatizations of the mid-90s, really history-making transfers of ownership. Now we've got the second wave of mass privatization going on in Russia, and Olga Diagonova is the head of the Federal Property Management Agency of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much. Starting from the beginning of 90s, Russia is trying to decrease the presence of the state in the economy, and actually doing that quite successfully. For now, statistics might be different, but overall we see that actually the level of the presence of the state in the economy is somewhere between 25% to 35% overall, and it's not that big. However, the privatization agenda is still on the way. and still actually government really thinks on the way how we can increase the productivity of the state-owned enterprises and basically replace the role of state as a shareholder with the role of the regulator. A few years ago, the Russian government set up the list of top 30 companies and basically set up the second wave privatization agenda. And if we do actually our work right, the overall valuation of these companies by the end of year 2016, actually, and the revenue which we might get from the privatization can stand for $100 billion or more. And we have a certain time frame where those top 30 companies should be privatized. So we started this process from year 2012, and most likely this process should be over by year 2016. Quite short period of time, and quite big companies which we need to deal with. And actually the list of these companies include the companies like the Savings Bank of the Russian Federation, the #1 bank in Russia, and Rosneft. The company like Transneft and the Russian Railways. So one of the biggest companies in Russia basically making a lot of, and bringing a lot of value to the Russian economy.
And we had Sberbank a couple of months ago.
Absolutely.
Biggest IPO in emerging markets.
And making plan means that we are not only planning these activities, but we are also on the way of executing them. So in the first 6 months of year 2012, there was basically no sale. And Russia was criticized by not following the agenda of privatization. But then starting from July, we actually concluded 7 deals. And there are a few deals in the pipeline on the way to be finished by the year, actually by the end of the year. And one of those deals was one of the most successful deals. That was the privatization of the Savings Bank of the Russian Federation. The 7% actually went for $4.5 billion. And actually, that's one of the biggest deals Russia ever had. But what's important about Russia these days and the agenda, that the goal which was set by the government is to make this process clear and transparent and very predictable, not only for the investors, but also for the citizens in the country, to ensure that the lessons from privatization of the first wave back from the 90s are well learned. So with every deal, we need to be clear, transparent, predictable, and actually the result should be, to a certain extent, accepted by the economy and by the citizens. For doing that, we rely on the international and the global expertise. As for each particular deal, we talk with the global banks, and we engage as an agent on behalf of the Russian state. We engage the key banks, the key investment banks, to help us to structure the deal and basically execute on each particular deal. And this list covers not only the global banks, I mean the international ones, but also the Russian local investment banks, which by doing that will get appropriate expertise and will help us to develop the foundation for the local financial market. And with this regard, we rely not only on the international infrastructure like New York Stock Exchange or London Stock Exchange, but we're also responsible for developing the local infrastructure like NYSE. And by doing that, I'm sure, along with the privatization and by helping Russia become the international financial center, we will welcome you way better than we are doing that right now. But at the end of the day, our goal as the agency and actually as the team of those who are helping companies to go through privatization, to develop their equity stories, build their roadmaps, to ensure that the valuation when we sell them will be at actually their highest levels. And we are not in the rush. Even with a specific deadline of year 2016, there is no specific timeline which each particular company should go and become privatized. We will do that at the time when the company is ready, when the market is ready to accept the company, and when investor base is built to support the intentions of the Russian government. And the idea of the second wave of privatization to move away from the revenue as a key priority for privatization into actually building the productive and efficient companies which should continue working not only on the local market but also on the global market as well.
Thank you. And for anybody who thinks that Russia's a state-dominated economy, can you tell us what the basic rate of income tax is?
Oh, well.
13%.
13%. 13%.
13%.
The lowest, one of the lowest
Absolutely.
Across the globe.
Absolutely. David Gottlieb, you have a practice here in New York, very well known. Cleary Gottlieb, of course, big experience in Russia. My company's experience over the years has been we can enforce our rights. It used to be terrible. Now it's much, much better than it was. Still patchy, but certainly doable. What's been your experience?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. First, I just wanted to say that we're very pleased to be involved in this event and to be sponsoring it. We do have a very good practice in New York. We also have a very good practice in Russia. Our practice in Russia goes back more than 20 years. We were there just at the breakup of the Soviet Union. We assisted the Russian government in its debt restructuring following the breakup of the Soviet Union, and we've been there ever since. Our practice is not just a government practice, but we're very much involved in the capital markets, in the largest M&A transactions that are going on in Russia, and now in litigation and arbitration as well. And you're absolutely right, we've seen a huge development. And to my way of looking at it, Russia's one of the places in the world that's changed the most in the last 20 years. And much for the better in terms of many aspects of business and society, and particularly of the legal framework. It is quite an ambitious privatization program you've undertaken, and there's quite an ambitious development of the legal framework to support it. So we have seen over the past 3 to 5 years complex and comprehensive amendments to civil legislation to make much of this possible. There are amendments to the Civil Code, to the securities laws, to the joint stock company laws, to the takeover rules, to the insider trading rules. These are laws that Russia never had, that the Soviet Union never had. So they were starting from scratch to build up an infrastructure to help support the development of a domestic market and an international market for Russian securities. There are further contemplated amendments. It's far from complete. But these are things that are getting passed with much more efficiency than some of the legislation passed in Western countries in the United States these days. Some very important developments, the adoption of a law on central depository. So it will now be possible for an interlinking between the Russian domestic markets, the European markets, and the US markets.
And that's imminent, right?
That's imminent, right. It's January is when the central depository is supposed to come into effect, and that will allow much more seamless communications between settlement and transfer of securities between the Russian market and the US markets, because these, and the European markets, which were very much separate up until this point. There are more robust disclosure requirements coming in. From an administrative and institutional standpoint, as Ms. Derogova mentioned, there's just been a merger of the 2 large stock exchanges in Russia to create the Moscow Exchange, a real large trading platform for Russian issuers to help foster a domestic market. There's internal restructuring of the Federal Service for Financial Markets, the Russian equivalent of the SEC. And there's now talk even about creating a super regulator with the merger of the central bank and the FSFM to create a super regulator for the financial markets. So much, much development.
Thank you very much, David. Finally, I'd like to bring in Albert Ganyushin. I'd like to thank Albert for involving Prosperity in this historic event, and to congratulate you for putting together what really is a historic gathering here. Many congratulations to you. How do you see as your native country, as a bridge between your native country and the world's biggest pool of capital, what do you think could happen over the next few years? How excited are you?
Well, we here at the NYSE Euronext are very excited, and let me just explain kind of the perspective that I take. My day job is to help companies from EMEA to cross borders, to list internationally. And what does it mean? It actually doesn't only mean European companies coming here to the US. We are well known globally for operating the New York Stock Exchange, which is the most liquid trading exchange platform in the world. But actually also in Europe, we operate also the most liquid pan-European market called NYSE Euronext. And in fact, we've registered a listing venue in London to compete with London Stock Exchange off this largest European trading platform. So my day job, therefore, is to help companies from the EMEA region to list either in Europe or the US, make the right decision, choose the right path. That's one aspect. And in the night job, I help our senior management to, in the dialogue with the Moscow Exchange and Moscow International Financial Center around what we can potentially help the Moscow International Financial Center with in terms of developing it, because we're also one of the largest exchange technology providers in the world and have experience of operating multiple markets, not only equity markets around the world, including the largest derivatives market in London. So therefore, from my point of view, we are very interested in Russia because we can do a huge amount of things for Russia and with Russia. And firstly, I think we can, we are delighted to be in dialogue as to how we can help build the Moscow Financial Center. As everybody, David, you mentioned, there's been a merger of two exchanges, right first step. There are, I think, two key measures that clearly need to be implemented as soon as possible for the Moscow market to work better, which is clearly the central depository and central clearing, but also T+N settlement of transactions. Because, you know, one of the reasons, and I criticize a little bit the London market, not LSE per se, but just the way the London market has been set up. Many times, Russian companies list in London and trade in London, frankly, not because the trading layer in London is that good. The trading layer is often actually used by the investors in Moscow, but it's the avoiding kind of a clearing and settlement, if you like, in Russia. That's one of the reasons why there's a lot of offshore trading. And that, I think, can be eliminated by fixing the settlement and clearing in Russia and bringing all of that traffic that is currently avoiding Russia for no reason other than, you know, lack of convenience, if you like, that can be brought back in. So I think that's one first kind of block that we would like to work on. And the final one, of course, we would like to give Russian companies access to the deepest and the most liquid capital market in the world, which is the United States. Because we think it's truly complementary to the liquidity that will be built up in Moscow. We've certainly found for large companies, New York has been the anchor place for big privatizations. And it's been the anchor place, frankly, for large private companies from Europe who successfully build up liquidity pools both in Europe, in their domestic markets, and additional pools of liquidity in New York. And that surely should be of benefit to big Russian, successful Russian companies access the New York market, build additional liquidity, because it helps the development of Moscow as the international financial center in the meantime.
Thank you very much. Deputy Minister, you talked about the nitty-gritty, a great English phrase, if I may say so. We've all touched on, haven't we, the initiative to make Moscow an international financial center, and those of us who live and work in Moscow, we can see these huge buildings appearing. We can see brand new metro stations appearing. What's actually happening? Give us some concrete measures that are taking place, that have either taken place. We've heard about the merger of RTS and NYSE, which is very important to get less OTC. What else would you say to this very, very important audience? Mm-hmm. Tell them what they won't necessarily read in their Western newspapers.
Well, thank you for this question. Well, let me respond to Albert's comments. Well, as was already mentioned, the central clearinghouse and the central depository is already set up. In fact, it's at the latest in January it starts working. Hopefully, it can actually even start working. At the latest in January it starts working. Maybe it actually even starts working earlier. That's number one. Speaking of T+N is one of the top priorities, and I do hope that that's going to be resolved in as early as first half of next year. I think number three is just last Thursday, the upper house of parliament has adopted a law which actually significantly widens the investment capabilities of the state pension fund, which is 2.5 trillion rubles worth of assets. Now this fund is going to be invested significantly more freely in various Russian securities. Now we're going forward, and what we're going to do there, we're already working on devising a system which, for Russians, makes the tax treatment of investing in securities equal to investing in bank accounts. And I think that's very, very important. The Russian bank accounts pool is about 10 times more than the pool of Russians investing in in securities. Now, when we fix this tax discrimination, I hope that there will be significant flow of funds into the Russian bonds and equities, of course.
We also have, don't we, the introduction of compulsory IFRS/GAAP for an American audience accounting. in our experience, we often have seen companies adopting IFRS. Some of our portfolio companies have had IFRS, GAAP for many years, but now it's by law from the beginning of 2013, right?
That's correct. That is obviously I think is very important. And the similar thing to this, of course, is the improvement of the reporting requirements and reporting standards, and of course the control over them, which is why, as again was mentioned already, there's now a big discussion about how to improve the regulation, and we have the government has proposed to the president actually indeed to merge the security service with the central bank.
And we know from a lot of our potential investors can't invest in Russia just because it hasn't got a centralized securities depository. That will be another obstacle that will be removed. Chairman Dmitriev, there has been quite a lot of discussion about Russia building up a pool of domestic long-term capital to hopefully make the market less volatile, and the Deputy Minister just discussed it then. Just tell us a little bit briefly about the changes in the law that will hopefully bring more of Russia's enormous savings base, and increasingly it's an onshore savings base, of course, ruble denominated rather than dollar denominated. How can we get more of that into the equity market to try and stabilize equities?
Vneshekonom Bank is not only the bank for development, but it's an agent for the government in managing pension funds, saving part of the pension fund. And we now possess in a range of 70% of pension funds in our portfolio. And legislation is changing yearly to improve using these funds. Now 60% of these funds are allocated in governmental securities, and only roughly 50-20% are aimed at supporting local industries and local enterprises. The changes in legislation will help us dramatically to improve situation and to use these long-term funds to support infrastructure and to support various industries. And what Alexis said is just a proof that our legislators, the government, are keen to improve environment in our country to allocate long-term funds into infrastructure projects and into securities issued by Russian companies.
It's a major challenge, though. Brazil has 7 or 8% pension funds equivalent to about 7 or 8% of its annual GDP. Russia isn't that far behind, but Brazil has 4/5 of those funds in the equity market, and Russia has less than 10% in the equity market. For international investors, it's pretty important. They want to see domestic long-term money in the market, so hopefully it will become more stable. Is that understood at the top of government?
Of course. And the changes in our legislation, changes in approaching the idea to allocate long-term funds into the economy is really a proof that in our country the government, legislators, management companies, they're pretty well aware that only changes in the approach and changes in the policy will assist us to get those long-term money into the economy.
Thank you. We're talking about Russia's investment climate, of course. On the minds of many people here will be corporate governance. We will come to that. Just one or two other little specifics I want to get through before we move on to corporate governance. Olga, obviously there is a major privatization program going on, yet we've only had, even with the Sberbank SPO, if you like, we've only had less than $10 billion of SPOs on the Russian, an IPO/SPO on the Russian market this year, 10 billion last year. Back in 2007, we had 36 billion in a single year. How important is the international environment in terms of the timing of Russia selling off yet more state assets? Because, of course, if you sell them off too cheaply, then Russian citizens will think that they've not got a good deal.
Well, each particular deal will definitely depend on the international market, especially if you go to the capital markets. However, you can watch for the windows of opportunities at the time when you as a company is ready to grab the opportunity at the time when it comes. So that means that the company should be ready by itself. And our goal is to develop the companies to the extent that, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter when the window of opportunity comes. They need to be ready every day, every month, for every window of opportunity. But Russia is not alone, and it's not like excluded from the international market, so we are fully dependent on the investor base coming from abroad. And for that particular purpose, I actually fully supported the ideas which Alexis had been talking about, that we need to develop our local investor base. And for that particular purpose, we need to inject the pension funds, the local pension funds, into the privatization model as well. And to a certain extent, privatization deals actually will help infrastructure to start working and the pension funds to be actually in use for the particular deals. And we need to ensure that we make all that happen all together.
But what's the major motivation for the privatization process here? Is it only a revenue-raising exercise? Is it a changing the shape of the economy exercise? Is it a bit of both? Which would you rank more highly?
We want companies to be more efficient and actually economy be more productive. And that's the major purpose for government to leave actually and sell its stake and bring the private investors and private investor base into the companies.
David, both our companies heavily involved in Russia. We've lost friends. Lots of our Western associates think we're crazy, right? Why do you think the press is so bad? Because it does weigh very, very heavily on everyone's mind. The Deputy Prime Minister is smirking at me now. Why is it so bad, do you think?
I mean, I think, there's just a fundamental misperception, probably on both sides, about the opportunities available in the other country. It goes back decades, right? I mean, when we were growing up, you didn't grow up in the United States, but I did. When you grew up in the United States, you always heard, there are two major global superpowers, the U.S. and Russia, and we're the good ones and they're the evil ones, and that's the story of the world, and it provides intrigue and it provides interest and it sells newspapers. We've come a very long way from that through the Cold War. We're now in an opportunity of cooperation, and we've now got a great opportunity for cooperation and business development. But it's hard to change old perceptions, and that's why these events, I think, are so important to raise the profile of the opportunities in Russia and the developments that are going on in Russia among U.S. investors, and the same should be true on the other side. There's a great opportunity for Russians to invest in the United States as well. We haven't seen much outbound investment. It's very small relative to some other countries, but there's a great opportunity to invest. Russians have a lot of cash to come invest in the U.S. markets and in U.S. companies.
So we lose one myth, Russia's our enemy, and then we get onto another myth, it's only oil and gas. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of our investments aren't oil and gas. Oil and gas is 17% of GDP now, down from 40% as recently as 2003. Oil and gas is 20% of FDI in the last 5 years on UN numbers. I mean, a lot of your business must be non-oil and gas deals, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's still, it still is the backbone of the Russian economy, but I think the Russians understand that they need to diversify the economy away from oil and gas to develop other sectors and there's a real opportunity to do that. We heard about the expanding middle class in Russia and the expansion of consumerism. There's a real opportunity to develop the consumer sectors, the professional sectors, the financial sector. And diversification is very important, but I think the Russian government understands that.
Chairman Dmitriev, Russians are extremely entrepreneurial people. How can we get the small and medium-sized business sector to grow? You've mentioned it a couple of times. Deputy Prime Minister mentioned it. It really does, to an outsider's perspective, seem like a major area where Russia has to expand to get away from this perception that a lot of the companies are very, very large companies.
There are a few examples how to deal with this problem and how to deal with the idea to grow up small and medium enterprises and medium class in our country. There should be institutions, there should be money, but there should be skills as well. We support small and medium enterprises, as I mentioned, through our subsidiary, the Bank for Small and Medium Enterprises. But it's not the only opportunity and not the only tool to assist small and medium enterprises. We have a program which is launched with international financial institutions and local institutions for development. IFC is working with us to support small and medium enterprises through special financial facilities. We set up with KfW, the one
German
of
equivalent,
German equivalent to the National Bank, a special fund to invest into small and medium enterprises in our country. We allocated each $150 million to this fund, but we hope, and there are good indications, that by the year end next year, we will have $1 billion to be invested into Russian small and medium enterprises. And what sort of enterprises we support? It's not trade and agricultural sort of things, but high-tech, innovative companies with good potential for growth. And supporting small and medium enterprises, we serve a very important mission to breed medium class in our country. And medium class, growing medium class in our country is the basis for investments for Kirill Dmitriev in his Russian Direct Investment Fund. And the growing middle class in our country is the basis for growing industries where the middle class is investing its money, healthcare, agricultural business, good quality products, and so on and so forth. And really, to finalize, the government is very keen to set up and create appropriate infrastructure to support small and medium enterprises.
Deputy Finance Minister, of course, Russian people are wealthy. Russia has, by a considerable margin, the highest per capita income of any emerging market country in the G20. We've all read, hopefully, about the big retail story, Russia now being the largest retail market in Europe, which is why there's been so much FDI. Do you think the sort of shape of taxation will change, where taxation will begin to fall more and more on individuals? Because it's important to a lot of people here thinking about investing in the retail space in Russia. Russians are sitting on enormous wealth. Russia has very, very high owner occupancy of their homes because, of course, the massive giveaway of homes in the mid-90s. A lot of people sitting on a lot of equity. Households have very little debt. Do you think there'll be more personal taxation in the medium term?
Well, I think that this is one of the biggest achievements of recent reforms, is to keep this personal income tax, which you referred to, very low at 13%. Essentially, if there could be any changes on particular items of consumption, I'm talking about very singled out situations, but it's very important to keep the earners to actually be very motivated to continue to earn, right? Even if we are going to increase any taxation, this could be related to very expensive cars or very expensive houses, sure, but not related to actually people who work and earn their money. Now here, we are absolutely focused on continuing to make incentives that actually people continue to be very motivated from the tax point of view to actually to earn more and more and therefore spend more.
Okay, now we're getting in the 5 minutes or so we've got left, we're going to talk about governance. Albert, in your experience, how big a job do you think Russia has? Investors in Russia, leaders of Russia, regulators, officials, how big a job do we have to convince the rest of the world, not least the good men and women of New York and American capital markets, that the governance issues really are okay to the extent that they're not necessarily a deal breaker? And I'm going to ask each of the panel the same question.
In my experience of working in other markets other than Russia, for example, India and others, and I have worked in London for more than 20 years, so have a kind of, if you like, both a London and a US perspective on it. I think there are a couple of observations. Firstly, from a selfish point of view, promoting, if you like, US listings to Russia as one of the options, if you like, for Russian equity market. Of course, the US regulation is very, very robust compared to European, and that's a good thing. I think the unspoken truth is the level of compliance of a company, a Russian company listed in New York, is intrinsically inside the company is significantly higher than that, for example, listed in London. That's just the truth. So that's a good thing. So promoting access to the best markets in the world is one of the ways to improve that. So that I think is fantastic.
Deputy Minister, do you think it is the case that governance in Russia is so much worse than other large emerging markets, or do you think it's just a perception thing?
I think a lot of it is perception, because a lot of Russian companies, in fact, most of the Russian companies, large Russian companies, are listed either in New York or in London, and that obviously tells something that there should be some requirements, right, to have good compliance. However, I do take that we need to improve a lot there, and hence why we actually are thinking about a major reform of the securities market supervision and regulation. So that's something we will be working on very closely.
Chairman, your thoughts briefly on this subject of international perceptions of Russia's governance?
Of course, we do have much to do to improve corporate governance, but it's not only legislation, but practices which make our companies to be in line with the best practices of corporate governance. And again, I refer to Kirill Dmitriev. When he invests with co-investors from outside, one of the purposes is not only, money is of course good, but one of the purposes to get foreign investors and foreign investments into the country is to assist our company with best practices of corporate governance.
And Olga Degunova, of course, one new regulation coming in that we haven't mentioned, but all investors in Russia, it's very much on their minds. Majority state-owned companies will be required to pay out now 25% of their net profit in dividend, a major shift, certainly when combined with compulsory IFRS. But what other single measure would you like to see? The Deputy Prime Minister's there, you can give him your suggestion. What other single measure would you like to see to make the assets that you're trying to sell to the world more valuable? Tough one.
Well, actually, we've done a lot. The Russian government already did a lot of changes to ensure that actually these assets become attractive. Apart from dividend policy, there was the most recent decision where the state-owned enterprises in Russia cannot take part in privatization of the other state-owned enterprises. That means that actually the floor is opened for the private companies. So in addition to that, actually a lot of changes have been done in the corporate governance. In 2,500 companies, joint stock companies in Russia, we have more than 2,000 independent directors working on a daily basis in the board of directors. And this is a huge step ahead compared to where Russia used to be a few years ago. And then if actually the company is really attractive to the foreign investors, that all matters. That investors can compete on the local market with the private companies and not with the state. That the board of directors will not cheat the owners at the time actually when the deal is conducted, that actually the overall environment will be supportive for the new investor when it comes. And government will continue playing its role as regulator. And what's important also to think that government agenda in privatization is way broader than top 30 companies which are in the list and on the radar screen of the government. They're just the highlights showing the scale and the importance of those companies. But also in the agenda, we have another 2,000 companies, the small ones, somewhere in the distant regions, somewhere in the different industries, where the mid-sized business can really take part and become the owners of the former state-owned assets. I think this is the clear indicator for the investor base that Russian government is serious, not only with the big stakes in the big organizations, but also with the overall process being built as ongoing process, basically taking place all across Russia. So for that purpose, a lot of things done, but we have something in mind.
And I'm just going to give the last word to David. Your views on where governance could be in 3 or 5 years' time in Russia.
Well, there's no doubt that corporate governance is very important. It's important in Russia, it's important outside of Russia. There's a heightened sense now that corporate governance across the world is inadequate and companies need to bolster the resources. I think, though, that the Russians understand that. I mean, you have to understand how these companies developed. You sort of have, you either have the state-owned enterprises that are now being privatized, or you have companies that grew very large with entrepreneurial oligarch groups that were closely held companies. And of course, there weren't a lot of outside directors. But the government, I think, is leading the way in preparing companies for IPOs. There's a new regulation of the Russian Federation that requires independent directors to sit on the boards of state-owned companies. They're replacing government representatives with independent directors. There are now proposals to introduce independent directors into the joint stock company law for private companies. So I think Russians understand there have been a number of notable transactions where corporate governance has delayed or hindered the success of the transaction, and nobody wants that. So I think there's an understanding, I think, that it's developing. I agree that it's both the law and the practice, but it will happen. It will evolve just like it has in other countries, and we'll see more robust corporate governance, I think.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your forbearance. I hope you've learned something from this panel. We've got another panel coming up hosted by Ryan Chilcott from Bloomberg. I'd like to thank Alberta and the New York Stock Exchange again for putting on this event. And could you join me in giving our panelists a round of applause? Thank you.